Canada. There is a layer of earth that does not belong. It runs beneath the soil of 3 continents. It sits at the same depth, whether you find it in the forests of British Columbia, the plains of Alberta, the tundra of the Northwest Territories, or the riverbeds of Ontario. Geologists who have spent their entire careers studying rock formations have walked past it thousands of times without knowing what it meant. It is thin. In some places it is barely a centimeter thick. In others it is no thicker than a piece of paper pressed between 2 chapters of history. But what lives inside that layer is not soil. It is not sediment deposited over centuries by patient rivers. What lives inside that layer is the chemical signature of an event so catastrophic, so total, so absolutely world-altering that the scientists who first identified it could not bring themselves to say out loud what it meant. That layer is called the black mat, and what is frozen inside it tells a story that took 12,800 years for the world to finally start hearing. Tonight, we are going back. We are going back to a Canada that no map has ever recorded, a Canada that no history book has ever described in full, a civilization so ancient that its people watched the last of the woolly mammoths walk across land that would one day become the city of Edmonton. We are going back to a world that was alive, complex, populated, and thriving in ways that modern archaeology is only now beginning to understand. And we are going to follow the evidence, piece by frozen piece, to the moment when everything changed. Not gradually, not over centuries of shifting climate, not through the slow erosion of one way of life giving way to another. We are talking about a change that arrived in an instant, a change that rewrote the continent, a change that the Earth itself has been trying to tell us about for nearly 13,000 years, because something hit this planet 12,800 years ago, and the evidence is still frozen in the ground beneath your feet. Let us begin with the people, because this is their story first. Humans arrived in North America far earlier than most people realize. The old textbook answer, the one that most of us learned in school, was that the first Americans crossed a land bridge from Siberia somewhere around 13,000 years ago, walking east into a new world through a gap in the ice sheets as the last glacial maximum began to retreat. That story is still partially true, but it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously, because people were in the Americas before that. Long before that, archaeological sites in Chile, in Mexico, in the eastern United States, and in Canada itself have now produced evidence of human presence that pushes the timeline back significantly further, past 16,000 years, past 20,000 years, with some researchers arguing that the Western Hemisphere was populated in multiple waves going back far beyond what mainstream archaeology was prepared to accept even a generation ago. But for the purposes of what happened 12,800 years ago, the people who matter most are the ones archaeologists call the Clovis culture. The name comes from a small city in New Mexico, where in 1929, a 13-year-old boy named Ridgely Whiteman found unusual stone points eroding out of a dry arroyo. When professional archaeologists arrived the following year, they found something extraordinary. The stone tools were buried alongside the bones of extinct animals, mammoths, ancient horses, camels that had once roamed the American plains in herds. The tools were unlike anything previously documented in North American archaeology. They were large, beautifully worked, with a distinctive fluting, a channel chipped up from the base of the point that made them unlike any other lithic technology on the continent. And they were old, older than anyone at the time was prepared to believe. Subsequent finds spread the picture. Clovis sites appeared across the entire North American continent: Arizona, Virginia, Montana, and crucially in Canada, in Alberta, in the Yukon, in Ontario, in British Columbia. Wherever the glaciers had retreated enough to allow human movement, the Clovis people followed. They were extraordinary hunters, capable of taking down prey many times their own size. They moved in small bands across a landscape of staggering abundance, because the world they lived in was not the Canada of today. 12,800 years ago, Canada was extraordinary. The ice was retreating, not gone, but retreating. The Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacial system that had covered most of the country under kilometers of frozen water, was in the process of pulling back northward. In its wake, it left a landscape of raw, freshly exposed land, dotted with glacial lakes, threaded with meltwater rivers, carpeted in mosses and sedges, and the first tentative forests pushing up from the south. The climate was warmer than it had been in millennia. The air was rich, the rivers were full, and the animals were breathtaking. The woolly mammoth was not simply a prehistoric curiosity. It was a keystone species, the dominant megafaunal animal across the northern latitudes, capable of weighing 6 tons, standing 11 feet at the shoulder, and living for 60 years. Mammoths shaped the landscape the way elephants shape the African savanna today. They pushed over trees, opened up grasslands, created waterholes, and served as prey for every large predator in the ecosystem. Alongside them lived the mastodon, a different but equally massive creature, stockier and more forest-adapted than the mammoth, browsing on shrubs and tree branches in the boreal margins. The giant ground sloth, which could reach 6 meters in length and weigh as much as a car, moved through the southern reaches of what would become Canada. The short-faced bear, the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore to ever walk North America, stood over 3.5 meters tall on its hind legs and could run down prey at speeds no modern bear can match. There were also ancient horses, multiple species of them, wild horses that had evolved on the North American continent over millions of years and spread to Eurasia across the Bering Land Bridge before they vanished from their homeland entirely. There were ancient camels. There were glyptodonts, enormous armored animals related to modern armadillos, some of them the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. There was the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon, with its impossibly elongated upper canines. There was the American lion, larger than any lion alive today. There was the dire wolf, heavier and more powerfully built than the gray wolf, hunting in packs across the open plains. This was the world the Clovis people lived in. This was the world they hunted in, raised their children in, told their stories in, buried their dead in. And all of it, almost all of it, was gone within the span of a human lifetime. To understand how that happened, you need to understand the Younger Dryas. Climate scientists who study ice cores, who drill kilometers down into the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets and read the chemical record of ancient atmospheres trapped in those frozen layers, have known for decades that something strange happened to the global climate approximately 12,800 years ago. The world was warming. The last glacial maximum was ending. Temperatures across the Northern Hemisphere had been rising steadily for millennia. Everything in the climate record pointed toward a continued warming trend that should have, eventually, produced the stable Holocene climate that allowed human civilization to develop agriculture, build cities, and eventually end up here, with you watching this and me trying to describe the unimaginable. But the warming did not continue. It stopped. Suddenly, catastrophically, completely. In the Greenland ice cores, the evidence is undeniable. Within a period that some researchers estimate at as little as 1 to 3 years, the average temperature in the Northern Hemisphere dropped by between 8 and 15 degrees Celsius. That is not a gradual change. That is not a trend. That is not a cycle. That is an event. A sudden planetary scale climate disruption that plunged the entire Northern Hemisphere back into conditions resembling the height of the last ice age, after the world had already been warming for thousands of years. The cold lasted approximately 1,200 years before the climate finally, definitively, began its recovery. The period is called the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in European sediment cores at the precise moment when temperatures collapsed. The flower blooms in cold conditions. When the climate scientists found its pollen flooding European lake sediments at the same moment the ice core temperatures collapsed, they knew what they were looking at, but they did not know why. For decades, the standard explanation was the freshwater hypothesis. The Laurentide ice sheet, as it melted, was producing vast quantities of fresh meltwater that pooled in enormous glacial lakes across what is now Canada, most famously in the massive Lake Agassiz, which at its maximum extent was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. The theory suggested that this freshwater lake eventually breached its glacial dam and drained catastrophically into the North Atlantic, flooding the ocean with fresh water and disrupting the global ocean circulation system that moves warm tropical water northward and keeps Europe and northern North America habitable. The disruption of that circulation, the theory went, caused the temperature collapse. It is a compelling theory. It has good supporting evidence, and it almost certainly played a role in what happened, but it does not explain everything. It does not explain the timing. It does not explain the suddenness. It does not explain a layer of platinum found at the same depth in sediment sites across 3 continents. It does not explain the nanodiamonds. It does not explain the shocked quartz. It does not explain the spherules of melted iron and silica that rain down through the sediment record at the same precise moment, at sites separated by thousands of kilometers, from British Columbia to Belgium to Syria. It does not explain the black mat. In 2007, a team of researchers led by geophysicist Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that set off one of the most heated scientific debates of the 21st century. The paper was titled, "In the Careful, Measured Language of Scientific Publishing, Evidence for an Extraterrestrial Impact 12,900 Years Ago that Contributed to the Megafaunal Extinctions and the Younger Dryas Cooling." The word that matters in that title is extraterrestrial. Firestone and his colleagues had spent years collecting samples from sites across North America. They went to places where the black mat was visible, places where the geological record showed the same sudden transition at the same horizon, places where, in the layer immediately below the black mat, you found the bones of mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, horses, and the stone tools of Clovis hunters. Places where, in the layer immediately above the black mat, you found none of those things. No mammoth bones, no Clovis points, nothing. As if the world above the black mat had been reset. What Firestone's team found inside the black mat layer itself changed everything. Platinum. In concentrations far above the background level of platinum in normal Earth sediment. Platinum is a siderophile element, meaning it has a strong chemical affinity for iron and tends to migrate downward into the Earth's mantle over geologic time. In the upper crust of the Earth and in normal surface sediments, platinum is vanishingly rare. But there are objects that carry platinum in abundance: meteorites, asteroids, cometary fragments. When something falls from space and impacts the Earth, it leaves a platinum signature in the sediment layer at the time of impact. The platinum anomaly in the black mat was real, reproducible, consistent across dozens of sites. Then came the nanodiamonds. Nanodiamonds are exactly what they sound like. They are diamonds, but they are so small, measured in nanometers, that they are invisible to the naked eye. They can only be detected with electron microscopes, and they form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. the kind of conditions that exist in two places on Earth, deep inside the planet's mantle, and at the site of a hypervelocity impact when a cosmic object strikes the surface of the Earth with enough force to compress and superheat the surrounding material to conditions that replicate the interior of the planet. The nanodiamonds Firestone's team found in the black mat layer included a specific variety called Lonsdaleite. Lonsdaleite is hexagonal in its crystal structure rather than cubic, like ordinary diamond. It forms at even higher temperatures and pressures than regular diamond. On Earth, it has been found in exactly one other context before the black mat discovery. It has been found at known meteorite impact craters. The scientific community responded with what can only be described as vigorous skepticism. This is appropriate. This is how science is supposed to work. Other researchers went to the same sites and ran their own analyses. Some found the same anomalies, some did not. Papers were published arguing that the nanodiamonds were misidentified. Counterpapers were published defending the identification. The debate became at times contentious in ways that raised eyebrows even within academic geology, but the sites kept multiplying. By 2018, researchers had identified the black mat's impact markers not just in North America, but in sites across Europe, in Syria, in South Africa, in Chile, a global field of evidence, all pointing to the same moment in time, all showing the same chemical fingerprint, all sitting at exactly the depth in the sediment record that corresponded to 12,800 years ago. The hypothesis that emerged from all of this evidence is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it proposes something that once you sit with it long enough becomes not merely plausible, but almost inevitable, given what the evidence shows. Something hit the Earth 12,800 years ago. Not a single object striking a single point on the surface. Something far larger and more complex than that. The current leading model, supported by a growing body of evidence, proposes that what struck the Earth was a fragmenting comet, a massive icy body that had broken apart somewhere in the inner solar system and arrived at our planet as a dispersed field of fragments, some of them small, some of them large, spread across a swath of sky wide enough to impact multiple locations simultaneously or in rapid succession. The fragments struck the Laurentide ice sheet. This is the detail that changes everything about what happened next. If a large cometary fragment strikes open ocean, the primary damage is from the impact tsunami and the thermal pulse. Terrible, but localized. If a large cometary fragment strikes bare rock, you get a crater, you get ejecta, you get a fireball, you get a thermal pulse that radiates outward in all directions. Terrible, but again, relatively localized. But if a large cometary fragment, or multiple large cometary fragments, strike a continental ice sheet several kilometers thick, something different happens. The ice does not absorb the impact, it explodes. The energy of the impact vaporizes enormous quantities of ice instantly, throwing water vapor, ice particles, and whatever debris was in the underlying rock layer into the upper atmosphere in quantities that dwarf the ejecta from any conventional impact crater. The thermal pulse, instead of radiating outward from a single point, propagates across the surface of the ice at speeds and temperatures that are almost impossible to visualize. The meltwater produced in the seconds and minutes following such an impact is not measured in cubic kilometers. It is measured in the kind of numbers that require scientific notation. And because the ice sheet was covering most of what is now Canada, the people living in the immediate vicinity were not just experiencing a disaster. They were at ground zero for an event with no modern parallel. Let us talk about what that day might have looked like. It is important to be honest about the limits of what we can know. We have the chemical evidence. We have the sediment record. We have the bones and the tools and the layers of earth. We do not have a written record. We do not have a survivor's account that has been preserved in any recoverable form. What we can do is take the physical evidence and extrapolate from it, carefully and honestly, knowing that we are building a picture from fragments. In the sky, in the days or weeks before the event, there may have been signs. Ancient peoples across multiple cultures preserve stories of a great fire in the sky, a serpent or dragon made of light, a star that moved against the pattern of stars. The comet hypothesis gives these stories a possible origin. A fragmenting comet in the inner solar system on an approach trajectory toward Earth would have been visible in the night sky before impact. It would have grown brighter. It would have developed a visible tail, or possibly multiple tails from multiple fragments, stretching across a significant portion of the visible sky. Whether the Clovis people noticed, whether they understood, whether they had time to tell stories about what they saw before the sky fell, we do not know. What we know is what the physics says happened when the fragment struck. The energy released by a comet fragment striking a continental ice sheet is enormous beyond easy comprehension. A fragment 1 kilometer in diameter, striking at the typical cometary impact velocity of somewhere between 20 and 70 kilometers per second, releases energy measured in tens of millions of megatons of TNT equivalent. The largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by any human civilization, the Soviet Tsar Bomba in 1961, released 50 megatons. You would need to detonate that weapon approximately 1 million times simultaneously to approach the lower end of the energy released by a single moderate-sized cometary fragment striking the Laurentide ice sheet. The thermal pulse from such an impact would have been visible across most of the continent within minutes. Not just visible, incendiary. The evidence for this is preserved not just in the chemistry of the black mat, but in the massive charcoal layer that accompanies it across much of North America. The black mat is black, in part, because it is full of soot, the soot of forests burning. The analysis of that soot tells us it came not from localized wildfires, but from a burning event of continental scale. Trees were burning across North America on that day. Not in one place, everywhere. The hypocenter of the fire was not in a jungle or a prairie, it was in the ice. But the thermal pulse radiated outward from the impact zone at temperatures high enough to ignite everything combustible within a radius that may have stretched from the impact point in what is now Canada all the way down into the present-day United States. The charcoal layer in the black mat has been dated. The charcoal layer corresponds to the same moment as the platinum and the nanodiamonds and the impact spherules, all of it at the same depth, all of it from the same moment. The sky above what is now Canada would have turned from clear to black within hours, not from smoke alone, although there was smoke. The impact threw material into the upper atmosphere in quantities that research teams have estimated were sufficient to significantly reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth globally. This is the same mechanism that causes the darkness following a major volcanic eruption. The mechanism that caused the year without a summer in 1816 following the eruption of Mount Tambora, but scaled up by orders of magnitude. The temperature dropped, not over years, not over decades. Within months, the upper atmosphere was thick enough with ejecta and soot that the sunlight reaching the surface of the Northern Hemisphere was measurably reduced. The plants that had been growing in the brief post-glacial warmth began to die. The animals that depended on those plants for food began to starve. The predators that depended on those animals began to starve in turn. And the meltwater from the ice sheet, the catastrophic, instantaneous melting of billions of tons of glacial ice, poured into the ocean. Here is where the freshwater hypothesis and the impact hypothesis converge, because both things happened. The impact caused the meltwater pulse. The meltwater pulse disrupted the ocean circulation. The ocean circulation disruption drove the global temperature collapse. The Younger Dryas was not one thing. It was a cascade of consequences, each one triggering the next, all of them ultimately traceable back to a moment when something fell from the sky and struck the ice. The question of where exactly the impact or impacts occurred has been one of the most complicated aspects of the investigation. This is because, unlike a standard meteorite impact on bare rock, an impact on an ice sheet does not necessarily leave a crater. The impact energy can be partially or wholly absorbed by the ice itself, leaving a depression that fills almost immediately with meltwater and then is subsequently erased by the movement of the remaining glacial ice over the following centuries. The Laurentide ice sheet continued to exist in diminished form for several thousand years after the Younger Dryas event. By the time the ice was finally gone, any surface evidence of an impact structure would have been scoured clean. But there is a feature on the landscape of eastern North America that has been puzzling geologists for well over a century. It was noticed by aerial survey pilots in the early 20th century, when aviation first made it possible to look at the land from above in ways that ground-level observers never could. It was studied, debated, argued over, and largely set aside as inexplicable. Now it is at the center of one of the most significant ongoing debates in planetary science. The Carolina Bays. If you look at satellite imagery of the coastal plain of North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and parts of Maryland and Delaware, you see something that should not be there. Scattered across the landscape in numbers that some surveys estimate at more than 500,000 individual features are elliptical depressions. They are oriented in roughly the same direction. They have raised rims, particularly on their southeastern edges. They are not random. They have a structure, a consistent orientation that speaks of a common origin from a single directional event. The standard geological explanations for the Carolina Bays, the ones that were proposed before the impact hypothesis gained traction, have never been entirely satisfactory. Wind erosion, lake formation, groundwater dissolution of underlying limestone, all of these have been proposed, and none of them fully account for the consistent orientation and the raised rims. You do not get consistently oriented depressions from random geological processes. Orientation implies direction. Direction implies a source. The impact hypothesis proponents suggest that the Carolina Bays are secondary impact features, not craters from direct cosmic impacts, but scars left by the debris thrown outward from a primary impact on the Laurentide ice sheet to the northwest. When the ice exploded, it threw boulders of ice, blocks of frozen sediment, and other material outward at high velocity. That material came down across the landscape to the southeast, striking the ground at low angles and creating the oriented elliptical depressions that survive as the Carolina Bays today. This is not a proven mechanism. It remains controversial. Other researchers have proposed that the Carolina Bays are simply ancient lake beds, shaped by prevailing winds and groundwater processes over thousands of years. The debate continues, but the orientation, the rims, the sheer number of them, these details keep pulling researchers back toward an origin that involves something arriving from the sky at high velocity. Meanwhile, in Canada, the frozen record of what happened has been waiting patiently in places where the ice has protected the sediment from the kind of erosion and agricultural disturbance that has complicated the picture elsewhere. The permafrost of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories has preserved biological material from the period of the Younger Dryas in extraordinary detail. The cold that drove the Younger Dryas cooling was, paradoxically, a kind of preservation mechanism in the high latitudes. Material that would have decayed and decomposed in warmer conditions was frozen in place. Bones, plant material, insects, and in some cases even soft tissue, all preserved in the permafrost as if in a natural deep freeze. The permafrost record from this period shows the megafaunal extinction in stark, unambiguous terms. The bones of woolly mammoths in the Yukon do not thin out gradually as you move up through the sediment column. They stop at a specific horizon, at the same depth where the chemical markers of the impact appear. Below that horizon there are mammoths. Above it there are none. The mammoths that were alive in what is now the Yukon 12,800 years ago did not slowly decline. They were gone within a geologically instantaneous period. The same pattern appears for the mastodon, the same pattern for the horse, the same pattern for the camel, the same pattern for the giant ground sloth, although the evidence for this species is harder to read because it lived primarily to the south of the ice margin. The same pattern, less clearly, for some of the large predators, including possibly the short-faced bear and the American lion. Not all large animals went extinct at the Younger Dryas boundary. The bison survived, the elk survived, the moose, the caribou, the musk ox, the wolves, the coyotes, all survived. This is itself a clue. The pattern of extinction is not random. The animals that vanished were, with some important exceptions, the large-bodied specialists, the animals that depended on specific food sources in specific habitats. The generalists, the animals that could adjust their diets and their ranges as the climate changed, survived. But even this distinction is not perfect. The mammoth was a remarkable ecological generalist, capable of eating a wide variety of plant materials and surviving in a wide range of habitats. Its extinction was not obviously inevitable from its ecological profile alone. The disappearance of the Clovis people as a distinct archaeological culture at the same moment is one of the most debated aspects of the Younger Dryas event. The Clovis culture, defined by its distinctive fluted points and its association with mammoth hunting, essentially vanishes from the archaeological record at the Younger Dryas boundary. It is replaced, after a gap in the record, by different tool traditions, different subsistence patterns, different archaeological signatures. This does not necessarily mean that all Clovis people died. The population did not go extinct. The humans who survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe were the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North America who were present when European contact began. The biological continuity is not in question. What changed was the culture, the technology, the way of life built around hunting the great megafauna. When the megafauna vanished, the culture that had co-evolved with them vanished too. But the question of how many people died in the immediate aftermath of the event is one that researchers have been reluctant to address directly, because the answer, extrapolated from the archaeological and biological evidence, is deeply uncomfortable. The population of North America at the time of the Younger Dryas event was small by any modern standard. The best estimates, based on the distribution of Clovis sites and the carrying capacity of the pre-Younger Dryas landscape, suggest a total human population for the continent of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals. These people were spread across an enormous area, concentrated in the more productive ecological zones south of the retreating ice margin. They lived in small mobile bands, moving seasonally in response to game movements and resource availability. When the impact occurred, the people closest to the ice margin in what is now Canada were the most vulnerable. The thermal pulse, the shock wave, the immediate firestorm, these would have been lethal to anyone within a large radius of the impact zone. But even for the people farther south, beyond the immediate kill zone, The consequences were catastrophic. The animals they depended on were dying. The plants those animals depended on were dying or buried under ash and soot. The climate that had made the landscape productive was collapsing toward a new ice age. Archaeological evidence from the period immediately following the Younger Dryas boundary shows a dramatic reduction in human activity across much of North America. Not just a change in tool styles or hunting strategies, a reduction in the sheer number of sites, in the density of occupation, in the evidence of sustained habitation. The human population of the continent took a severe hit. How severe is impossible to determine precisely, but the evidence suggests that the event and its immediate aftermath may have been the closest North American humanity has ever come to extinction. The story survived. That is the thing that breaks through all of the data and the chemistry and the sediment analysis and the academic debate and reminds you that this was not an abstract geological event. This was a catastrophe that happened to people. And people, when they survive catastrophes, tell stories. Across many of the indigenous cultures of North America, there are oral traditions describing a great fire from the sky, a time when the earth was consumed by flames, a time of terrible cold that followed the fire, a time when the great animals vanished and the world was remade. These stories have been dismissed by many scholars as myth, as allegory, as the kind of archetypal narrative that all human cultures generate to explain the natural world, and some of them may be exactly that. But the specificity of some of these accounts, the fire from the sky, the cold that followed, the death of the great animals, the struggle of the survivors, is difficult to explain purely as metaphor when the physical evidence of exactly those events is preserved in the sediment record. The Blackfoot people of what is now Alberta speak of a time when the world was burned and remade. The traditions of the people of the Great Plains include accounts of a time when the old animals died and the world changed. The Mi'kmaq of eastern Canada preserve stories of a great catastrophe that reshaped the world. None of these traditions specifically describe a cometary impact in language that would satisfy a modern scientist, but the consistency of the themes, fire, cold, extinction, survival, rebuilding, across cultures that are separated by thousands of kilometers and centuries of independent development, is remarkable. There is a reason these stories sound alike. They are describing the same event. Now let us turn to the frozen evidence itself, because this is where the story becomes most precise, because it is in the ice that the Younger Dryas event has left its most detailed and most unambiguous record, and it is from the ice that we can understand, with a clarity that no other archive provides, exactly what happened to the climate of the Earth 12,800 years ago. The Greenland ice sheet is a library. Each year snow falls on Greenland, compresses under the weight of subsequent snowfalls, and is preserved as a layer of ice. Each layer is a year. Each layer contains bubbles of the atmosphere that existed when that snow fell. Each layer contains chemical markers, isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen, that tell us what the temperature was when that precipitation fell from the sky. Read the layers correctly, and you can reconstruct the climate of the Earth year by year going back more than 800,000 years. The record of the Younger Dryas in the Greenland ice cores is stark. Going upward through the ice, the climate record shows a world that was gradually warming after the last glacial maximum. The oxygen isotope ratios are shifting in the direction that indicates warmer temperatures. The dust content of the ice is decreasing, which indicates that the great bare expanses of glacial outwash plain, the source of much of the dust that blows into Greenland from North America and Europe, are being colonized by vegetation. The overall trajectory is clear. The world is warming. And then at a specific, precisely dated layer, everything changes. The oxygen isotope ratios shift abruptly in the direction of extreme cold. The dust content spikes. The chemical markers of a changed atmosphere appear suddenly. And mixed into the ice at exactly that layer are things that should not be there. Impact spherules, tiny glass beads formed when rock or soil is melted by extreme heat and flung into the atmosphere, where it cools rapidly into perfect spheres. Platinum anomaly, elevated levels of ammonium, which is produced in enormous quantities by the combustion of large volumes of organic material. The Greenland ice at the Younger Dryas boundary is not just recording a climate event. It is recording the arrival of material from a catastrophic event somewhere on the surface of the Earth. The ice caught the fallout. 12,800 years later, researchers drilling through the ice pulled it out and read what it said. What it said was, something burned on a scale that the world had not experienced in recorded geological time. Something happened that threw material into the upper atmosphere with enough force and in enough quantity to circle the globe. Something happened that changed the climate of the entire Northern Hemisphere in what the ice record suggests may have been a matter of years, possibly less. The Antarctic ice cores show a different Southern Hemisphere perspective on the same event. The signal in Antarctica is less sharp than in Greenland, which is consistent with the hypothesis that the primary impact or impacts were in the Northern Hemisphere. But the Antarctic record also shows the Younger Dryas climate signal, though expressed differently and with some timing. Complications that researchers are still working to understand. The global nature of the climate disruption is not in question. What happened at 12,800 years ago was a planetary event, not a regional one. Let us come back to Canada because this is where the physical evidence on the ground is most directly connected to the experience of the people who lived through the event. The Murray Springs site in Arizona is not in Canada, but it is one of the most important sites for understanding what the Younger Dryas boundary looked like in the ground. It is a deeply studied Clovis site where, in the 1960s, archaeologist Vance Haynes excavated the bones of a mammoth alongside beautifully preserved Clovis tools. The mammoth's bones sit at the base of the black mat. Above them is the mat itself, the dark, organic, rich layer that marks the boundary. Above the mat is sediment with no mammoth bones and no Clovis tools. The black mat at Murray Springs contains a layer of tiny carbon spherules, the product of the incomplete combustion of organic material at high temperatures, exactly the kind of particles produced in enormous quantities by a firestorm. The carbon spherules are accompanied by magnetic spherules, tiny iron-rich balls formed when iron-bearing material is melted at extreme temperatures and resolidifies in flight. And there is the platinum anomaly, the elevated platinum concentrations that do not belong in a normal sediment deposit, and that point inescapably to an extraterrestrial origin. Similar sites in Canada tell the same story. In Alberta, at the Wally's beach site near the town of Warner, researchers have found the bones of horses, camels, and other megafauna beneath the Younger Dryas boundary. The Wally's beach site is remarkable because it preserves not just the bones, but what may be direct evidence of Clovis. Hunting at the site, stone tool processing marks on the bones. The megafauna bones stop at the same sediment horizon that marks the Younger Dryas event elsewhere. Above it, nothing. The Topper site in South Carolina, one of the oldest and most controversial pre-Clovis sites in North America, shows a complex sediment sequence that includes the black mat and its associated markers. The archaeological material below the mat is rich. Above it, the record changes character dramatically. In the peat bogs of Ontario and the lake sediment cores pulled from the bottoms of hundreds of glacial lakes, across the Canadian Shield, the Younger Dryas boundary is visible, not because of a single dramatic marker, but because of the totality of what the sediment record shows at that moment. Pollen cores from southern Ontario show a dramatic shift in vegetation at the Younger Dryas boundary. The warming climate plant assemblages that had been establishing themselves in the centuries before the event, the trees and shrubs that prefer warmer conditions, suddenly give way to the pollen of cold, adapted plants. Spruce, sedges, the flowers of open, cold, treeless landscapes. The forest retreated. The cold came back. In the lake sediment cores from Quebec and Ontario, there is a visible change in the sediment character at the Younger Dryas boundary. The sediment that was being deposited in the decades before the event reflects a warming, productive ecosystem. The sediment that was deposited immediately after the event reflects a colder, more erosion-prone landscape, consistent with the loss of vegetation cover and the return of cold conditions. The charcoal layer in Canadian lake sediment cores at the Younger Dryas boundary is real and widespread. Researchers who have studied these cores have noted the unusually high concentrations of charcoal at this specific horizon, representing a major burning event that affected large areas of the landscape simultaneously. This is not the charcoal signature of localized wildfires. It is the charcoal signature of continental-scale fire. The Agassiz flood is another piece of this puzzle that has been waiting for a proper explanation. Lake Agassiz, the enormous glacial lake that covered much of what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, drained catastrophically at some point near the Younger Dryas boundary. The drainage of Lake Agassiz has been invoked as a cause of the Younger Dryas cooling through the freshwater mechanism, but the timing of the drainage has been difficult to pin down precisely, and some researchers have argued that it occurred in multiple episodes rather than a single event. The impact hypothesis offers a different framing. If the Laurentide ice sheet was catastrophically disrupted by one or more impact events, the dam that contained Lake Agassiz, which was formed by the ice sheet itself, may have been breached not by the gradual melting of the glacial maximum, but by the violent, instantaneous meltdown triggered by the impact. This would explain both the timing of the Lake Agassiz drainage and the scale of the freshwater pulse that disrupted the ocean circulation. The Mackenzie River Valley in the Northwest Territories has been studied for evidence of catastrophic flooding at the Younger Dryas boundary. The geological record of the valley shows features consistent with a massive, rapid flood event that is difficult to explain by normal glacial melting processes. The scale of the erosion features, the distribution of exotic boulders and other glacial erratics, and the structure of the valley walls all point to a water event that dwarfs any normal glacial outburst flood. Now let us talk about the science and the scientists and what happens when a hypothesis challenges deeply held assumptions. The scientific response to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been, to put it carefully, complicated. The initial reaction to Firestone's 2007 paper was highly skeptical. This was appropriate. The claims were extraordinary. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the initial evidence, while intriguing, was not without its problems. Some researchers who attempted to replicate the findings at specific sites reported that they could not find the markers that Firestone's team had identified. This created a genuine scientific conflict, with different teams looking at the same or similar sites and arriving at contradictory conclusions. The question of whether the nanodiamonds were correctly identified became particularly heated, with some mineralogists arguing that the material described as Lonsdaleite nanodiamonds was actually misidentified graphene or other carbon forms that could have a terrestrial origin. The debate has continued, but in the years since the initial 2007 paper, the weight of evidence has, incrementally, and with significant controversy still unresolved, shifted toward taking the hypothesis more seriously than it was initially received. A major study published in 2018 in the Journal of Geology, led by James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, expanded the evidence base dramatically. The team analyzed samples from 52 sites across 4 continents and found that 23 of those sites contained the full suite of impact markers: the platinum, the nanodiamonds, the impact spherules, the charcoal layer, all at the same stratigraphic horizon corresponding to 12,800 years ago. The geographic spread of those 23 sites, from California to Chile to Europe to the Middle East, makes a localized geological explanation for the markers essentially impossible. The platinum signal has been one of the most robust markers. A 2018 study of ice cores from Greenland found a platinum anomaly at the precise layer corresponding to the Younger Dryas onset. This was significant because the Greenland ice cores are among the most precisely dated archives in paleoclimatology. The platinum anomaly in the ice is not at an ambiguous depth. It is at the depth that corresponds to within a year or two to the onset of the Younger Dryas, cooling at 12,800 years before present. The Abu Huraira site in Syria added a crucial dimension to the picture. Abu Huraira is one of the oldest known agricultural sites in the world, a place where some of the earliest evidence of plant cultivation has been found in the archaeological record. It sits at the Younger Dryas boundary in a way that allows archaeologists to see what happened to early human settlement at the time of the event. The site shows a clear disruption at the Younger Dryas boundary. And in the sediment at that boundary, researchers found not just the impact markers, but something more vivid: melt glass, material that had been heated to temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond any normal combustion temperature, and had fused into a glassy form. The distribution of the melt glass across the site and its presence at high concentrations in contexts that may represent the floor surfaces of the settlement at the time of the event suggests that the inhabitants of Abu Huraira experienced the thermal pulse directly. People were at that site when the sky caught fire. The melt glass in their floor is the physical residue of the heat that came down on them. This brings us to one of the most striking aspects of the entire Younger Dryas impact story, which is the question of memory and myth. Human cultures do not preserve specific events in oral tradition for 12,800 years in literal terms. The details degrade, the specifics become metaphorical. The event gets transformed by thousands of years of retelling into a story that carries the emotional and cultural weight of the original, but has shed the literal details. But some things persist: the memory of fire from the sky, the memory of a great cold, the memory of a world that was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. These are themes that appear with remarkable consistency across cultures that could not have been in contact during the historical period, that are separated by ocean and mountain range and thousands of years of independent development. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis gives these stories a physical event to attach to. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region have traditions describing the world as having been destroyed and remade, with the current world being not the first, but one in a series of worlds. The traditions of the Lakota speak of world destruction and renewal. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest coast, one of the cultures whose ancestors were certainly present in North America at the time of the Younger Dryas event, have traditions involving catastrophic fires and floods. The Ktunaxa, whose traditional territory in what is now British Columbia and Montana places them very close to the impact zone as currently understood, preserve oral histories of dramatic landscape transformation. None of these traditions are simple transcriptions of a scientific event. They are living cultural expressions that have been shaped by thousands of years of telling. But the themes they share with the physical record are difficult to dismiss. Let us talk about what science has learned and what it still does not know about the object or objects that caused the Younger Dryas impact. The leading model, as the evidence has accumulated, points toward a comet, rather than an asteroid as the primary impactor. Asteroids are rocky objects. Comets are icy bodies composed of ice, dust, and trapped gases with a rocky core. The distinction matters for the nature of the impact because a fragmenting comet would behave differently than a fragmenting asteroid on its final approach. A comet breaks apart more easily, producing a wider dispersal of fragments over a larger geographic area. A comet impact on an ice sheet would involve the interaction of enormous quantities of cometary ice with the glacial ice of the ice sheet, amplifying the steam and water vapor component of the impact's immediate aftermath. The torrid meteor stream is a broad complex of debris in the inner solar system, associated with the comet Encke that produces the torrid meteor showers that Earth passes through every year in October and November. The torrid complex is the remnant of a much larger parent body, a comet or protoplanetary object, that fragmented at some point in the past. The debris field is enormous by any standard, and estimates of the size of the original parent body range from tens of kilometers to potentially over 100 kilometers in diameter. Bill Napier of the University of Buckinghamshire and Victor Klube of the University of Oxford proposed, in a series of papers beginning in the 1980s, that the torrid complex parent body was the source of one or more catastrophic impacts on Earth in the geologically recent past. Their theoretical framework, sometimes called coherent catastrophism, suggested that the fragmentation of a large cometary object in the inner solar system could produce episodes of intense bombardment as Earth passes through the debris field, with the potential for civilization-ending impacts on timescales of thousands of years rather than millions. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is compatible with the torrid complex origin theory. If the torrid parent body fragmented at the right point in its orbital history, a cluster of large fragments could have struck Earth at approximately 12,800 years ago. The mathematics of orbital mechanics have been worked out by several research groups, and the trajectory and timing are consistent. This is not proven. It is a hypothesis built on a hypothesis, but the internal consistency of the model is remarkable, and it makes specific predictions about the structure of the torrid complex that can in principle be tested by astronomical observation. In 2019, a team led by Piers Corbin presented analysis of radar data from the torrid meteor stream that identified, within the stream, a population of larger objects than had previously been catalogued. Not dust and small pebbles, which are what produce the visible meteors of the annual torrid showers, but larger fragments, potentially capable of producing significant damage if they struck Earth. This is still being debated and refined. The observation needs independent confirmation and further characterization of the objects involved. But the presence of large fragments within the torrid stream is consistent with the hypothesis that Earth was struck by torrid-associated objects in the geological past. Now, the megafaunal extinction. The loss of the great Pleistocene megafauna of North America, the mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, ground sloths, and dozens of other large species, at the end of the Pleistocene has been one of the great mysteries of paleontology since the 19th century. Two main explanations have dominated the debate for the past 50 years. The overkill hypothesis, championed most forcefully by paleoecologist Paul Martin, argued that the megafauna were hunted to extinction by the first human arrivals in North America. The climate change hypothesis, argued that the megafauna could not adapt to the rapid climate changes at the end of the last ice age and died out as their habitats shifted. Both hypotheses have supporting evidence and serious problems. The overkill hypothesis has the advantage of explaining why the megafauna extinctions in the Americas and Australia were much more severe than those in Africa and Eurasia, where humans and megafauna had co-evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, and where the megafauna had therefore developed behavioral responses to human predation. North American megafauna, the argument goes, had no experience of human hunters, and were therefore naive prey, easy to approach and kill. The Clovis hunters, with their sophisticated spears and their highly mobile hunting culture, could theoretically have driven down mammoth and mastodon populations faster than those populations could recover. But the numbers do not work well. The Clovis population was small. The megafauna population was large and distributed across an enormous area. Hunting a species to extinction requires sustained, high-intensity predation pressure over multiple generations, and the archaeological record does not show Clovis kill sites in numbers that would support the extinction of dozens of species across the entire continent in the relatively brief window before the Younger Dryas boundary. The climate change hypothesis has the advantage of invoking a mechanism that demonstrably occurred. The climate did change dramatically at the Younger Dryas boundary, but the climate had changed dramatically many times before during the Pleistocene, during multiple glacial cycles of similar or greater magnitude, and the megafauna had survived those changes. There is nothing in the biology of the woolly mammoth or the mastodon or the giant ground sloth that makes them uniquely vulnerable to the specific type of climate change represented by the Younger Dryas. They had survived similar climate swings before. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis offers a third explanation that resolves the problems with both the overkill and the climate hypotheses. The extinctions were not primarily from hunting. They were not primarily from gradual climate change. They were from a catastrophic event that directly killed large numbers of animals, and that, through the subsequent climate disruption, destroyed the ecological conditions that the surviving animals needed to maintain their populations. A mammoth that survived the initial firestorm would have faced a landscape where the vegetation it depended on had been killed by fire and covered by soot. It would have faced a rapidly cooling climate that compressed its viable habitat range into a fraction of its previous extent. It would have faced a landscape already stressed by human hunting pressure. The combination was lethal, not over millennia, over generations. The surviving megafauna in the Northern Hemisphere are not a random sample of the pre-Younger Dryas megafauna. They are the species that were either ecologically flexible enough to adapt to the post-impact landscape, or that were geographically distant enough from the primary impact zone to have survived with their populations and habitats relatively intact. The musk ox survived in the high Arctic, which was devastated by the cold, but which had a cold-adapted fauna and flora better suited to survive the Younger Dryas conditions than the temperate and subarctic fauna farther south. The bison survived by, among other things, being more geographically widespread and more ecologically flexible than the mammoth. The woolly rhinoceros and the woolly mammoth survived longer in Eurasia than in North America, which is consistent with the impact hypothesis if the primary impact zone was over the North American ice sheet. The Eurasian populations, which were more distant from the impact, would have experienced the climate effects but not the direct thermal pulse and firestorm. Their populations were reduced, but not immediately eliminated. The Eurasian mammoth population persisted in diminishing numbers for several thousand years after the Younger Dryas boundary before finally going extinct, with the last known mammoth population surviving on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until approximately 4,000 years ago. A dwarf mammoth surviving on an isolated island in the Arctic, thousands of years after the main population was gone. That image tells you something about the resilience of life, but it also tells you something about how complete the destruction of the mainland mammoth population was. The island population was the remnant of a remnant, the last survivors of a lineage that had been devastated 12,800 years ago. Let us come back to the Canadian evidence, because there is a particular category of frozen evidence in Canada that has not yet received the attention it deserves in the popular understanding of this event. That category is the permafrost fauna. In the permafrost of the Yukon and Alaska over many decades, an extraordinary collection of Pleistocene megafauna specimens has been discovered. Miners working placer gold deposits along creeks in the Klondike region of the Yukon have, since the late 19th century, been encountering frozen remains of ancient animals. Baby mammoths, horses, bison, cave lions, not just bones but actual specimens, with soft tissue preserved, with skin, with hair, with internal organs in some cases. The most famous of these specimens are the baby mammoths. Several specimens of infant woolly mammoths have been recovered from the Siberian and Alaskan permafrost, including the remarkable Lyuba, discovered in Siberia in 2007, and the specimen known as Nunchoga, discovered in the Yukon in 2022, and described as the best preserved woolly mammoth ever found in North America. Nunchoga was discovered by miners working a placer gold deposit on Trondak-Hwechin First Nation traditional territory, and she is approximately 35,000 years old, significantly predating the Younger Dryas event. But the patterns of preservation in the Klondike permafrost include specimens from a wide range of ages, including animals that lived and died right at the Younger Dryas boundary. The condition of some of these specimens has been striking. Some of the frozen animals from the late Pleistocene show evidence of extremely rapid burial, as if they were overwhelmed by sediment suddenly rather than dying and slowly being covered. This has been noted by researchers who have studied the Klondike deposits, and the interpretation of these sudden burials has been debated. One researcher who spent considerable time arguing that the Klondike permafrost deposits represented evidence of sudden catastrophic events was Frank Hibben of the University of New Mexico, who visited the Yukon in the 1940s and described the deposits in vivid terms. Hibben's interpretations were not accepted by mainstream geology at the time, and some of his specific claims were later challenged. But the puzzling aspects of the Klondike deposits that attracted his attention, the mixture of species, the fragmentary and disarticulated nature of some specimens, the apparent rapidity of burial, have never been fully explained by conventional processes. The muck deposits of the Yukon and Alaska, the layer of frozen organic material that sits above the gravel of the placer. Mining regions contain a spectacular amount of biological material from the late Pleistocene. Bones of mammoths, horses, bison, lions, and other animals are found in quantities that suggest these were periods of massive die-off, rather than the normal accumulation of individual animal deaths over thousands of years. The muck contains logs, leaves, and plant material mixed with bones in ways that suggest violent reworking of the landscape rather than slow deposition. The dating of material from these deposits places much of it in the late Pleistocene period that includes the Younger Dryas boundary. The interpretation of these deposits as evidence of a catastrophic event is not mainstream, but neither is it without serious scholarly support. In the Mackenzie Delta region of the Northwest Territories, research into the geology of the late Pleistocene has identified evidence of massive disturbance at the Younger Dryas boundary. The delta system, which represents the terminus of one of the longest river systems in North America, shows dramatic changes in its depositional patterns at the Younger Dryas horizon. The change from the pre-Younger Dryas depositional environment to the post-Younger Dryas environment is abrupt in a way that speaks of a sudden change in the processes governing the delta, not a gradual climatic shift. Now let us spend some time with what happened in the centuries after the Younger Dryas event began, because the story of what the survivors did, how they adapted, how they rebuilt, is as remarkable as the story of the catastrophe itself. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,200 years. 1,200 years is not a moment. It is not even a geological eye blink. It is 40 or 50 generations. 40 or 50 generations of people living in a world that was fundamentally different from the world their ancestors had known before the event. 40 or 50 generations of people adapting, changing, innovating, and surviving in a landscape where the great animals were gone, where the climate was harsher, where the abundance that the Clovis culture had exploited had been replaced by scarcity. The archaeological record of the Younger Dryas period in North America is thin in ways that are themselves informative. There are fewer sites. The sites that exist show different tool traditions than the Clovis culture. Smaller tools, more varied in their form, less specialized toward the hunting of large game. The people who made these tools were not waiting passively for the mammoths to come back. They were adapting to a world without mammoths. They were developing new subsistence strategies, new ways of extracting food from a landscape that had changed around them. The Folsom culture, which succeeded the Clovis culture in the post-Younger Dryas archaeological record, is defined by a different type of fluted spear point, the Folsom point, more delicate and more refined than the Clovis point, and it is associated not with mammoth hunting, but with bison hunting. The Clovis hunters were mammoth people. The Folsom hunters were bison people. The shift in prey species reflects the shift in the megafaunal landscape after the Younger Dryas. The mammoth was gone. The bison survived and flourished. The human cultures that survived adapted to the available prey. This adaptation was not instantaneous. The transition from Clovis to Folsom culture spans the Younger Dryas period itself, and the Folsom culture proper appears at the end of the Younger Dryas or in the early Holocene, when the climate was finally recovering from the cold of the past 1,200 years. The people who made Folsom points were the descendants of Clovis hunters who had survived the catastrophe and the subsequent cold period and had reinvented their material culture to match their changed world. In Canada, the archaeological record of the Younger Dryas period is particularly sparse, reflecting the combination of the reduced human population, the harsh climate, and the effects of continued glacial activity in much of the country. The ice sheets, although they never re-advanced to their glacial maximum extent, did stabilize during the Younger Dryas cold, and in some areas made small re-advances. The landscape of what is now Canada during the Younger Dryas was, in many places, either under ice, in the process of being reorganized by glacial meltwater, or so newly exposed from the retreating ice that it had not yet developed the productive ecosystems that could support large human or animal populations. The people who survived in Canada during the Younger Dryas were concentrated in the ice-free or refugia, the areas that were either south of the ice margin or in the small pockets of ice-free land that existed along the Pacific coast and in parts of the interior. The Pacific coast of British Columbia, which may have remained ice-free or become ice-free relatively early during the deglaciation, may have been a significant refugee population for people who were adapting to a maritime subsistence strategy based on coastal and marine resources rather than inland game hunting. The sea level during the Younger Dryas was still considerably lower than today, because much of the world's water was still locked up in the glaciers that had not yet fully melted. The coastline of British Columbia during the Younger Dryas extended considerably farther west than the modern coastline. Kelp forests and productive near-shore marine ecosystems may have provided food resources that supported human populations through the coldest and hardest years of the Younger Dryas. Evidence for this coastal refuge population has been difficult to find precisely because the coastline it occupied is now underwater, submerged by the sea level rise that accompanied the final deglaciation. The end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,600 years ago, was as abrupt as its beginning. The ice core record shows that the temperature in Greenland increased by something like 10 degrees Celsius in a period that some researchers estimate at as little as a decade or two. The climate transition back to warm conditions was not gradual. It was sudden. It was the kind of climate change that happens not over centuries of slow atmospheric adjustment, but over the span of a human lifetime or less. What caused the ending of the Younger Dryas is itself not fully understood. The ocean circulation that had been disrupted by the freshwater pulse at the beginning of the period eventually re-established itself as the remaining fresh water was mixed and dispersed through the global ocean. The atmospheric aerosols from the initial impact and the subsequent wildfires had long since settled out. The ice that remained on the continents was still enormous in extent, but was clearly losing mass to melting. Whatever the specific trigger for the end of the Younger Dryas, the climate system found its way back to a warming trajectory, and this time the warming continued without interruption into the Holocene, the current geological epoch in which all of recorded human history has taken place. The recovery of the North American landscape from the Younger Dryas was not instantaneous. 1,200 years of cold, drought, and reduced biological productivity had left the continent with impoverished soils, disrupted river systems, and an ecological community that had been reorganized by extinction and adaptation. The forests that had been retreating before the Younger Dryas began did not simply march back to their pre-event extent immediately. The recolonization of the landscape by plants and animals after the Younger Dryas was a process that unfolded over centuries. But it happened. Life is remarkably persistent. The human populations that had been reduced and stressed during the Younger Dryas began to recover and expand as the climate improved and the food resources increased. The archaeological record from the early Holocene in North America shows a proliferation of cultures, a diversification of subsistence strategies, and a gradual but sustained increase in the number of sites and the complexity of the material culture being produced. The people who rebuilt North American civilization after the Younger Dryas were doing so in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the event. The great megafauna were gone. The landscape was different. The climate, while warming, was still in the process of achieving the Holocene optimum that would allow the development of agriculture and complex societies in other parts of the world. But the human capacity to adapt, to innovate, to find new ways of living in changed conditions proved equal to the challenge. The descendants of the Clovis hunters, the ancestors of the modern indigenous peoples of North America, rebuilt. They developed new technologies, new social structures, new ways of relating to the transformed landscape. They spread back across the continent as the ice retreated and the habitable area expanded. They established the diverse and sophisticated cultures that were present across the Americas when European contact began 5 centuries ago, and they carried the memory of what had happened in their stories, in their ceremonies, in the oral traditions that have been passed down through the generations. The memory of fire, the memory of cold, the memory of a world that was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. These memories are imprecise in the details that science demands, but they are remarkable in the themes they preserve across the 12,800 years of telling and retelling that separates the event from the present. There is one more dimension of this story that we need to spend time with before we reach the end. That dimension is the question of what the Younger Dryas impact means for our understanding of human civilization. The standard narrative of human civilizational development goes roughly like this. Anatomically, modern humans evolved in Africa sometime around 300,000 years ago. Modern human behavior, including complex language, symbolic art, and advanced tool manufacture, emerged somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Humans spread out of Africa and across the world over the following tens of thousands of years. The development of agriculture, beginning around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, China, and a handful of other locations, allowed the development of large settled populations and ultimately of cities, writing, and the full complexity of what we call civilization. This narrative places the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas right at the critical transition point. The Younger Dryas event at 12,800 years ago hit at exactly the moment when the global climate conditions that would eventually allow agriculture to develop were coming into alignment. Before the Younger Dryas, the warming post-glacial climate was already producing the kind of productive ecosystems in which complex human cultures were flourishing. The Clovis culture in North America is evidence of this. The Natufian culture in the Levant, contemporaneous with the Clovis culture, is more evidence. The Natufians were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who were already exploiting wild cereal grasses in ways that were a step or two short of full domestication. The conditions for the agricultural revolution were nearly in place when the Younger Dryas hit, and the Younger Dryas destroyed those conditions. The Natufian culture collapsed at the Younger Dryas boundary. The pre-agricultural experimentation with plant cultivation that had been underway in the Levant was set back by 1,200 years of drought and cold. When the climate finally recovered and the Holocene began, the process had to start over. Agriculture as we know it emerged in the early Holocene after the Younger Dryas ended. The question that some researchers have begun to ask is whether there might have been Younger Dryas human cultures that had developed beyond what the standard archaeological record shows. The pre-Younger Dryas period was warm and productive. Humans had been behaviorally modern for tens of thousands of years. The time available for complex cultural and social development was substantial. If something analogous to early agriculture or early complex settlement had begun developing in the millennia before the Younger Dryas would have destroyed the physical evidence of it in much of the affected area. The impact, the firestorm, the meltwater floods, the sustained cold of 1,200 years, and then the sea level rise of the early Holocene that submerged coastal sites would have collectively erased most of the surface evidence of any pre-Younger Dryas cultural development in the Northern Hemisphere. This is speculative. There is no hard evidence of pre-Younger Dryas complex civilization in the standard archaeological record, but the absence of evidence is complicated by the fact that the event that we are discussing was specifically the kind of event most likely to destroy archaeological evidence. Sites that were occupied by people at the moment of the Younger Dryas event would have been burned, flooded, buried under meters of impact, ejecta, and subsequent glacial sediment, submerged by sea level rise. The probability that any such evidence, if it existed, would be visible and identifiable in the current archaeological record is low. What we know with certainty is that the Clovis culture, a sophisticated and successful way of life, that had spread across an entire continent was gone within a generation or two of the Younger Dryas event. And we know that what replaced it, in the slow rebuilding of the following millennia, was different in ways that reflect the loss of the world the Clovis people had known. Göbekli Tepe, in what is now Turkey, the extraordinary monumental site consisting of massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circles and carved with complex animal imagery, was built beginning around 11,600 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. Its builders were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. They mobilized what must have been substantial social organization and labor resources to construct monuments whose purpose remains unclear. Some researchers have suggested that Göbekli Tepe was built by people who were responding to the memory of catastrophe, who were creating a monument to the sky, to the events that had traumatized their ancestors. Whether that is true cannot be proven, but the timing is striking. The most complex monument built by hunter-gatherers in the entire archaeological record appears at exactly the moment when the Younger Dryas ended and the world was rebuilding. It appears in a region that was at the margin of the Younger Dryas impact zone, far enough from the North American epicenter to have suffered the climate consequences without experiencing the direct thermal and mechanical damage of the impact itself. Its builders were among the first humans to begin the reconstruction of a complex culture after the catastrophe. Back in Canada, the story of reconstruction was slower and more difficult. The country was further from the warm core of the post-glacial recovery. The ice sheets that still covered much of the north were still retreating, still releasing meltwater, still reorganizing the drainage systems and the landscapes. The productive ecosystems that would support large, complex human populations were still forming. The people who were repopulating Canada in the early Holocene were doing so as pioneers, moving into landscapes that were still raw and ecologically immature. But they built it. Generation by generation, the people who are now called the ancestors of the modern First Nations of Canada expanded across the recovering landscape. They developed the intimate knowledge of local plants, animals, and seasonal cycles that is the foundation of indigenous ecological knowledge. They established the trading networks, the ceremonial traditions, the governance structures, and the artistic traditions that were in full flower when the first European explorers reached the shores of the country that would eventually bear the name Canada. All of that human achievement, the entire 12,000 years of cultural development from the end of the Younger Dryas to the present, was built on top of the frozen catastrophe. Literally, the black mat is beneath the soil of Canada. The platinum and the nanodiamonds and the impact spherules are down there at the same depth all across the country, waiting in the sediment record for the next researcher who wants to understand what happened. The evidence is still frozen. In the permafrost of the Yukon, where the bones of the last mammoths lie in the muck alongside the fragments of a world that ended 12,800 years ago. In the lake sediments of Ontario and Quebec, where the charcoal of a continental firestorm is preserved in the mud at the bottom of glacial lakes. In the peat bogs of British Columbia, where the pollen record shows the sudden return of cold climate plants at the Younger Dryas boundary as clearly as a page turning in a book. In the ice cores of Greenland, pulled out of the ice sheet in meter-long cylinders, and read like the annual report of a planet that has been keeping its own records for nearly 1 million years. The ice remembers. It is one of the things that ice does better than anything else on Earth. It remembers what the atmosphere was like. It remembers what the temperature was. It remembers when something burned on a scale that filled the sky with soot for months. It remembers the platinum and the spherules that fell out of the upper atmosphere after a fragmenting comet struck the ice sheet of the north and change the world. 12,800 years ago, Canada was a different place. It was a place of extraordinary abundance, of great animals and mobile peoples, of a way of life so successful that it had spread across an entire continent. And then something fell from the sky, and the world that existed before that moment was gone. The people survived. Not all of them, not easily, not without suffering on a scale we can barely imagine. But they survived, and they rebuilt, and their descendants are still here, carrying in their traditions and their stories and their genes the memory of a world that ended in fire and was reborn in cold and ice. The frozen evidence is patient. It has been waiting for nearly 13,000 years, and the scientists who have spent their careers kneeling in excavations, pulling sediment cores, drilling ice, reading the chemical signatures of ancient catastrophe are beginning to understand what it is saying. Something fell from the sky over what is now Canada. It changed the world, and the ice still has the receipts. If you have made it this far in this story, you have sat with one of the most important and most underappreciated mysteries in the history of the North American continent. The evidence for the Younger Dryas impact is real. The debate about its exact nature and mechanism is ongoing and legitimate. The scientists who are studying this question are doing careful, rigorous work in one of the most challenging environments that planetary science has ever confronted, trying to read the record of an event that happened before writing, before cities, before the world we know, in a landscape that has been scoured and flooded and frozen and thawed in the 12,000 years since the event occurred. What is not in debate is what the black mat represents. Something changed at that moment in time, changed suddenly, changed globally, changed in ways that ended a civilization and reshaped a continent. The chemistry of the sediment record across dozens of sites on multiple continents tells us that something extraordinary happened. The climate record of the Greenland ice cores tells us that the cooling of the Younger Dryas was not a gradual trend, but a sudden collapse. The biological record of the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions tells us that dozens of large animal species disappeared from North America within a window of time that is, by geological standards, essentially instantaneous. All of these lines of evidence converge on the same moment. All of them point to the same horizon in the sediment, the same layer in the ice, the same depth below the surface of every landscape that preserves the record from that time. The black mat, the layer that does not belong, the layer where the bones of the mammoths stop and the silence begins. 12,800 years ago, the sky fell over Canada, and the frozen earth has been trying to tell us about it ever since. We are finally, slowly, beginning to listen. The first civilization of Canada did not fade away. It did not fail. It did not simply fail to adapt to changing conditions over centuries of slow transformation. It was hit. It was hit by something that came from beyond the reach of anything that had ever threatened it before. And in the rubble of that catastrophe, in the cold and the darkness that followed, the survivors did what human beings have always done when the world falls apart. They kept going. They looked at the changed landscape, the sky empty of the great birds that had circled over the mammoth herds, the plains quiet where the herds had thundered, and they found what was left. They fed their children on what they could find. They moved when they had to move. They remembered what they had lost in the stories they told around fires that must have felt very small against the darkness of the Younger Dryas sky, and they taught those stories to their children, and their children taught them to their children, and the chain of telling stretched forward through 12,800 years of winters and summers and births and deaths until it reached the living cultures of the modern indigenous peoples of Canada, who carry in their oral traditions and their ceremonial life and their relationship to the land, the compressed memory of a world that ended and a world that was rebuilt in its place. The ice remembers everything. The people remember what the ice does not. Together, they tell a story that should be part of how every person who lives in Canada, who has ever looked at the vast landscape of the North and wondered about its deep history, understands the place they call home. Something happened here 12,800 years ago. The evidence is still frozen in the ground beneath the permafrost, beneath the peat bogs, beneath the lake beds, beneath the soil of every province and territory in the country. And the scientists who are reading that evidence are telling us, piece by piece, layer by layer, isotope by isotope, that the story of Canada does not begin with the arrival of European settlers or with the complex indigenous civilizations of the pre-contact period, or even with the post-Younger Dryas recovery of the early Holocene. It begins in fire, in a sky that fell, in the moment when the world that existed before was erased and the world we live in now began to take shape. Canada's first civilization is the frozen story in the ground. It is the platinum in the black mat and the nanodiamonds in the sediment and the charcoal of continental forests in the peat bogs and the mammoth bones cut off at a precise horizon in the permafrost of the Yukon. It is the story of a world that ended and of the people who survived it. And it has been waiting 12,800 years for someone to tell it. Let us go deeper into what the scientific community is still arguing about, because the debate itself is part of the story, and understanding the shape of the debate helps explain why this discovery has taken so long to reach the public consciousness. Science moves slowly. This is not a flaw. This is how science avoids being wrong in ways that cause harm. The requirement that findings be reproducible, that they survive peer review, that they accumulate enough confirming evidence from enough independent sources before they are accepted into the mainstream, is the feature of science that makes it the most reliable method for understanding the physical world that human beings have ever developed. But it means that genuinely revolutionary findings that challenge the established framework of a scientific field, face extraordinary resistance before they are accepted. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis challenged the established frameworks of multiple fields simultaneously. It challenged quaternary geology, which had settled on the freshwater hypothesis as the primary explanation for the Younger Dryas cooling. It challenged paleontology, which had developed a consensus around the overkill hypothesis for the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. It challenged archaeology, which had built an understanding of the Clovis culture that did not include any role for a cosmic catastrophe. And it challenged planetary science and astronomy, because accepting that a large cometary impact had occurred 12,800 years ago would force a reassessment of the risk posed by the Taurid complex and similar debris fields in the inner solar system. Each of these fields had scientists with reputations built on the existing consensus. Each of these fields had established methods, established timelines, established narratives that the impact hypothesis complicated or directly contradicted. The resistance to the hypothesis was not primarily scientific dishonesty or bad faith. It was the natural response of mature scientific disciplines to a challenge that required them to revisit assumptions that had been foundational to their work for decades. But the evidence kept accumulating. The work of James Kennett and his collaborators is worth examining in detail because it represents the most systematic effort to build the evidential case for the impact hypothesis on a global scale. Kennett, a distinguished oceanographer and paleoclimatologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, came to the impact hypothesis relatively late in his career, after spending decades studying ocean sediment cores and their climatic and biological records. His conversion to the hypothesis was based on his own analysis of the sedimentological evidence, and his subsequent work has been characterized by the kind of methodological rigor that is difficult to dismiss. The 2018 Journal of Geology study that Kennett and his team published involved the analysis of samples from sites on 4 continents. The methodological approach was explicit. The team looked for the full suite of impact markers at each site, not just 1 or 2 anomalies that could potentially have alternative explanations. The impact markers they looked for included the platinum anomaly, the nanodiamonds, the impact spherules in both magnetic and glass forms, the charcoal layer with its associated polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the carbon spherules, and in some cases the iridium anomaly, though iridium has proven to be a less consistent marker than platinum in this context. Finding the full suite at a site is much harder to explain by non-impact processes than finding any single marker alone. A single elevated platinum measurement might reflect a localized geological anomaly. A single charcoal layer might reflect a localized wildfire. But finding platinum plus nanodiamonds plus impact spherules plus charcoal at the same layer at a site separated by thousands of kilometers from other sites showing the same combination at the same depth corresponding to the same moment in time is not something that localized geological processes can explain. The 23 sites where Kennett's team found the full suite of markers include sites in California, New Mexico, North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in the United States. In Canada, the evidence has been documented at sites in Ontario and Nova Scotia, among other locations. In Europe, sites in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and the United Kingdom show the markers. In the Middle East, Abu Huraira in Syria is the most dramatic site, and the evidence has now been found in South Africa, in Chile, and in other Southern Hemisphere locations. A planetary field of evidence, all pointing to the same moment. The probability of this pattern arising by coincidence is statistically vanishingly small. One of the most important independent lines of evidence for the impact hypothesis comes from the study of ancient fires. A research team led by Adrian Mellett of the University of Kansas analyzed the charcoal and wildfire record at the Younger Dryas boundary and compared it with the expected wildfire activity from a cosmic impact scenario versus a gradual climate change scenario. The analysis found that the wildfire activity at the Younger Dryas boundary was far in excess of what would be expected from a purely climate-driven increase in fire frequency. The distribution of the burning across the landscape was also inconsistent with normal wildfire spread, suggesting instead a thermal pulse that ignited fires simultaneously across an enormous area rather than fires that spread outward from a single point of ignition. The estimate of the total area burned at the Younger Dryas boundary, based on the charcoal record across multiple sites, is approximately 10 million square kilometers. 10 million square kilometers is nearly equivalent to the entire land area of Canada. That is not a fire, that is a burning. The study of ancient microbes in sediment cores has added another dimension to the picture. Some researchers have found evidence in the sediment at the Younger Dryas boundary of a pulse of certain types of fungi that specifically grow on the dung of large herbivores. These fungi, known as Sporomyella, produce spores that are preserved in sediment and pollen cores, and the abundance of their spores in the record is used as a proxy for the abundance of large herbivores in the surrounding landscape. The Sporomyella record shows a dramatic decline at the Younger Dryas boundary that precedes or coincides with the broader megafaunal extinction, consistent with a rapid and catastrophic reduction in large herbivore populations at that moment. The implications of this fungal evidence are significant. The decline in large herbivore populations that the Spoor-Ormiella record documents is too abrupt and too large to be consistent with a gradual hunting pressure explanation. It is consistent with a rapid, event-driven population collapse. The timing matches the impact markers and the climate collapse of the Younger Dryas. In the deep sediments of lakes across Canada, the full picture is preserved in layers that have never been disturbed by the plow or the shovel or the construction machinery that has complicated the record. Elsewhere, lake sediment cores from lakes in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia have been contributing to this picture for decades. The cores tell the story in pollen, in charcoal, in chemical markers, and in the fossil remains of the tiny organisms, the diatoms and ostracods, and other microscopic creatures that lived in the lake waters and whose remains sank to the bottom and accumulated in the sediment. The story the Canadian lake cores tell at the Younger Dryas boundary is consistent and clear. A warm, productive environment trending toward increasing biological diversity and productivity as the post-glacial warming took hold, suddenly interrupted by a cold, harsh, low productivity environment that persisted for over 1,000 years before the warming finally resumed. The transition is not gradual. It is abrupt. In some cores, the change from one environment to the other appears to happen in a single annual layer, a shift so rapid that the sediment record cannot resolve whether it happened over a year or a decade or a century. It happened fast, faster than the resolution of the sediment record can capture. This is the kind of change that does not happen from gradual atmospheric processes. Gradual processes leave gradual records. Abrupt records require abrupt events. The story of the Younger Dryas, as recorded in Canadian lake sediments, is the story of a world interrupted, a world that was moving in one direction and was then violently redirected, a world that took 1,200 years to find its way back to the trajectory it had been on before the interruption. Let us also spend some time with the human genetic evidence, because the biology of the descendants of the Younger Dryas survivors has its own story to tell. Modern genetic studies of indigenous North American peoples have found evidence of significant population bottlenecks in the pre-Holocene ancestry of these populations. A bottleneck in genetic terms is a period when a population is reduced to a small number of individuals, reducing the genetic diversity of the surviving group and leaving a detectable signature in the genomes of their descendants. The most dramatic bottleneck in North American indigenous ancestry that genetic studies have identified corresponds, in timing, to the late Pleistocene period that includes the Younger Dryas. This does not prove that the bottleneck was caused by the impact. Population bottlenecks can be caused by many things: disease, habitat loss, climate change, and simple demographic accidents. But the timing of the bottleneck, combined with the archaeological evidence of reduced human activity across North America during the Younger Dryas, and the physical evidence of a catastrophic event at the Younger Dryas boundary, forms a coherent picture. The genetic evidence also tells us something important about the recovery. After the bottleneck, after the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene began, the genetic evidence shows a recovery and expansion of North American indigenous populations. New lineages appearing in the record as different groups found each other and the genetic diversity of the population increased again. The people rebuilt themselves genetically as well as culturally, as the warming climate allowed populations to expand and reconnect across landscapes that had been isolated during the cold of the Younger Dryas. The Anzac child, a Clovis infant whose remains were found in Montana and who is approximately 12,600 years old, represents one of the last or nearly last individuals of the Clovis culture in the genetic record. His genome has been sequenced and analyzed, and he is genetically ancestral to many modern indigenous peoples of North and South America. He lived right at the edge of the Younger Dryas boundary. His people, the Clovis culture, were gone within a few generations of his death. The genetic continuity from the Anzac child to modern indigenous peoples is a testament to survival. The biological lineage was not broken. The people survived the fire and the cold and the silence where the mammoths had been, and they kept their genes and their knowledge and their memories alive through 12,000 years of living in the world that the catastrophe had made. The science of impact risk, the study of how frequently Earth is struck by objects large enough to cause significant damage, has changed substantially in the past 2 decades. The Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet, which broke apart and struck Jupiter in 1994, in a spectacular series of impacts that were visible from Earth with amateur telescopes, demonstrated in real time that planetary impacts by fragmenting comets are not merely theoretical events. They happen. The question for Earth is not whether impacts occur, but how often, how large, and whether we have any way of identifying the threats before they arrive. The Taurid complex, if it does contain objects large enough to cause Younger Dryas scale impacts, represents a known, cataloged source of potential hazard. Earth passes through the Taurid stream twice each year, in late October and November, and again in late June and early July. During these passages, the planet moves through the debris of a comet that has been shedding material into the inner solar system for an unknown but potentially very long period of time. The visible Taurid meteor showers are the small material, the dust and pebbles burning up in the upper atmosphere. The larger objects, if they are there, do not produce visible streaks in the night sky unless they actually strike the atmosphere. In recent years, planetary defense programs have begun to catalog the larger objects in the Taurid stream more systematically. This work is still ongoing, and the full population of large Taurid objects is not yet well characterized. This is a gap in our knowledge of planetary risk that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis makes more urgent to fill. If something struck this planet 12,800 years ago with enough force to trigger a mass extinction, collapse a civilization, and push the entire Northern Hemisphere into 1,200 years of renewed cold, then understanding whether the source of that object is still present in the solar system, still crossing Earth's orbit twice a year, is not an academic question. It is a question about the future as much as the past. The SpaceGuard program and its successors have cataloged most of the large near-Earth asteroids in the size range that could cause civilization-threatening damage. The survey is thought to be reasonably complete for objects larger than a kilometer in diameter that follow well-defined orbits. But cometary bodies and the fragments of disrupted comets are harder to catalog because they can have orbits that bring them into the inner solar system on longer timescales and from directions that are less well surveyed. The Taurid complex parent body, if it was as large as some estimates suggest, would have produced fragments in a wide range of sizes, some of which may not yet have been identified or fully characterized. This is the dimension of the Younger Dryas story that connects the frozen past to the living present most directly. The event happened. The evidence is in the ground and in the ice and in the genomes of the people who survived. But the conditions that made the event possible, the presence of large debris in the inner solar system, capable of striking Earth with civilization-ending force, may not be entirely in the past. We are, in the most literal sense, living in the aftermath of a disaster that our species survived by the narrowest of margins. The cultures that rebuilt after the Younger Dryas, The cultures that eventually produced the agricultural revolution and the cities and the writing and everything that followed were carrying the trauma of that event in their stories and their ceremonies and their bones. And the solar system that made that event possible is still out there, still cycling through its ancient patterns, still populated with the debris of ancient catastrophes. This is not meant to be frightening. It is meant to be clarifying. The Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis, if it is correct, does not just explain what happened to Canada's first civilization. It explains why understanding our solar system, why investing in planetary science and impact risk assessment is not a luxury or a purely academic pursuit. It is the kind of knowledge that our species has already paid an enormous price for not having 12,800 years ago, when something came from the sky and changed the world. The children who survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe in whatever refuge their ancestors found, whether on the Pacific coast of a Canada whose coastline no longer exists, whether in the sheltered valleys of the interior where the thermal pulse was weakened by distance and terrain, whether in the southern latitudes that were beyond the worst of the immediate damage, those children grew up in a world where the sky had proven its capacity for violence in a way that no previous human experience had prepared anyone for. They told stories about it. Their children told stories about it. The stories changed as the generations passed, as the immediate memory faded into mythological time, as the specific physical details were replaced by the emotional and symbolic weight of what had happened. But the core truth of the stories survived. Fire from the sky, cold that followed, a world remade. 12,800 years later, we have the tools to read what the earth itself has preserved of that truth. The sediment cores, the ice cores, the permafrost specimens, the chemical analyses, the electron microscopes that can see nanodiamonds smaller than a wavelength of light. We have the tools to listen to what the frozen earth has been trying to tell us. Canada's first civilization ended in catastrophe and was rebuilt by survivors. That is the story the frozen evidence tells. It is a story about the fragility of everything we build, but it is also a story about the persistence of the people who build it. 12,800 years of building, 12,800 years of living in the world that the catastrophe made, finding it enough, making it home. The black mat is beneath the soil. The platinum is in the sediment. The nanodiamonds are waiting at the bottom of the lake cores. The mammoth bones are frozen in the permafrost of the Yukon, cut off at a precise horizon that marks the before and after of a world we will never entirely recover. And the people are here, still here, the descendants of the survivors, living in the country that was reborn from the fire. That is the story that the frozen evidence tells. That has always been the story. There is something that researchers have only recently begun to pay serious attention to, and it concerns the relationship between the Younger Dryas impact and the emergence of what some scholars have called the world's oldest religions. Not religion in the formal institutional sense that the word carries in modern usage, but the oldest evidence of organized symbolic practice, of ritual, of the kind of behavior that suggests a human community, grappling with questions that are larger than the immediate demands of survival. The timing is striking and has not gone unnoticed. The explosion of cave art in Europe in the late Pleistocene, much of which was produced in the period immediately surrounding the Younger Dryas, includes images that researchers have long struggled to interpret. The famous paintings of the Chauvet Cave in France, some of the oldest sophisticated representational art ever discovered, were produced by people living in roughly the same period as the Younger Dryas. The cave art of Altamira in Spain, of Lascaux, of dozens of other cave systems across Europe and beyond, shows an intensity and sophistication of visual expression that is remarkable. but it also shows something that has been harder to discuss in conventional archaeological terms: an apparent obsession with animals. Not animals simply as food sources, animals as the subject of intense, careful, reverential attention. The mammoths, the horses, the lions, the rhinoceroses, and the aurochs depicted on these cave walls were not grocery lists. They were something more. They were the expression of a relationship between human beings and the great animals that shared their world, a relationship that was about to be severed forever by the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas. Some researchers have suggested that the explosion of cave art in the late Pleistocene was not coincidental with the Younger Dryas impact, but was a response to it. That the people who survived the immediate catastrophe and the difficult centuries that followed were driven to create, to record, to preserve in visual form the memory of the world that had existed before. That the animals on the cave walls are not just animals. They are eulogies. They are the record of a world that was being lost, preserved in the deepest, most protected places the survivors could find, the caves whose depths were beyond the reach of the fire and the flood. This is interpretation. It is not established fact, but the emotional logic of it is powerful. When a world ends, the people who survive it try to keep it alive in whatever forms they can. In stories, in songs, in images carved and painted on stone walls that they knew would last longer than the fragile medium of human memory. In Canada, the equivalent tradition is not preserved in caves. The landscape of Canada at the time of the Younger Dryas was different from the landscape of Western Europe. The cave systems that exist in Canada, in British Columbia, and in the karst regions of other provinces do not contain the same density of Pleistocene rock art as the European caves. But the rock art traditions of the indigenous peoples of Canada, the petroglyphs and pictographs found across the country, carry their own record of relationship between humans and the natural world. The great animals of the pre-contact period, the bears, the whales, the eagles, the salmon, depicted on the rocks of the Pacific coast and the Great Shield and the plains, are the expression of a relationship that runs back further than European contact, further than the historical period, possibly back to the first human occupation of those landscapes after the Younger Dryas. The specific animals that are most commonly represented in indigenous Canadian rock art are, in many cases, the animals that survived the Younger Dryas extinction event. The salmon, the bear, the whale, the eagle, the bison. These are the animals that the survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe built their renewed relationship with the land around. The animals that were gone, the mammoths, the mastodons, the horses, the camels, do not appear in the rock art traditions that have survived, because by the time those traditions were being created, those animals were already extinct or nearly so. The rock art records the world after the catastrophe, not the world before, but the oral traditions of many indigenous Canadian peoples preserve hints of the older world. Stories of giant animals, stories of creatures that no longer exist, stories that describe a landscape populated by beings that match no living species, but that correspond remarkably well to the extinct megafauna of the Pleistocene. The Cree have stories of the Wendigo, a spirit associated with winter cold and cannibalism, that some scholars have interpreted as a folk memory of the desperate conditions of the Younger Dryas period, when the cold came back and the food disappeared, and human communities were pushed to the absolute limits of survival. The specific cultural form of these stories has developed over thousands of years of retelling and reinterpretation, but the emotional and experiential core of them, the memory of a time when the cold was absolute and survival was not guaranteed, may reach back to the Younger Dryas itself. The cultural memory of the catastrophe, preserved across thousands of years in the stories and ceremonies of the survivors and their descendants is one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story. It speaks to the extraordinary capacity of oral tradition to preserve important information across timescales that dwarf any written record. The oldest written texts are approximately 5,000 years old. The oral traditions that may preserve the memory of the Younger Dryas impact are more than twice as old. They have survived in a form that the physical sciences are only now beginning to corroborate. This convergence of indigenous oral tradition and modern planetary science and glaciological chemistry and archaeological sedimentology is one of the most intellectually exciting developments in the study of human prehistory in the current generation. It suggests that the two ways of knowing, the scientific way and the traditional indigenous way, are not in conflict but are describing the same reality from different angles, using different tools, preserving different aspects of the truth. The science tells us what happened in the physical world, the temperatures, the chemistry, the mechanics of the impact, the pattern of extinctions. The oral traditions tell us what it meant to the people who lived through it, the terror and the loss, and the determination to survive, and the stories told around fires to keep the memory alive. Neither account is complete without the other. Together, they give us the fullest possible picture of an event that shaped the human world in ways we are still discovering. In the end, the story of 12,800 years ago is not a story about death, although death was part of it on a scale that is hard to comprehend. It is a story about survival and about memory and about the stubborn insistence of life on continuing even when the conditions make continuation seem impossible. Something wiped out Canada's first civilization. The evidence for what happened is still frozen in the permafrost and the lake sediments and the peat bogs and the ice cores. The science is still being done, the debate is still being had, the evidence is still being gathered and interpreted and challenged and defended. The full picture is not yet complete and may never be entirely complete given the age of the event and the scale of the destruction. But the outline is clear. Something came from the sky, it struck the ice, it set the continent on fire. It sent the world back into an ice age for 1,200 years. It killed the great animals that had walked the land for millions of years. It devastated the human cultures that had been building a life in the extraordinary abundance of the post-glacial world, and the people survived. In whatever handful of sheltered valleys and coastal refugia and ice-free corridors remained, they carried their children and their knowledge and their memories forward through 1,200 years of cold and scarcity and rebuilding. And when the climate finally turned again, when the Holocene warmth arrived and the landscape began once more to fill with life, they were there, ready to expand again, to recolonize the recovering land, to build the cultures and the traditions and the wisdom that would characterize the indigenous world of North America for the next 11,000 years. The frozen evidence is the record of what was lost. The living cultures of the indigenous peoples of Canada are the record of what survived. Both deserve to be understood. Both deserve to be honored. Both are part of the deepest story of what it means to be human on this particular piece of the planet. The ice remembers, and so do the people. And together, finally, after 12,800 years, the story of Canada's first civilization is beginning to be told in full. There is one more thread worth pulling, and it concerns what is happening right now in the scientific community as this evidence accumulates and the debate sharpens. In the academic world, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has moved from fringe speculation to a serious, contested, actively studied proposition in a relatively short time. The number of peer-reviewed papers supporting or engaging with the hypothesis has grown substantially since the Firestone team's initial 2007 publication. The journals that have published work on this topic include some of the most prestigious in the relevant fields. The researchers involved include scientists with long track records of careful, rigorous work. This is no longer the territory of amateurs and enthusiasts. It is a legitimate scientific debate being conducted by serious professionals. At the same time, the opposition remains significant and the critiques remain serious. Some of the most fundamental objections concern the question of mechanism. Specifically, how do you hit an ice sheet with a comet and produce the specific pattern of effects that the evidence shows across 4 continents? The physics of an airburst over an ice sheet versus a direct contact, impact versus multiple simultaneous impacts at different locations, each produces a somewhat different expected pattern of effects. Working out which specific mechanism best fits the full range of evidence is a genuinely difficult scientific problem that has not yet been fully resolved. The absence of a confirmed impact crater is a persistent objection. The standard objection runs: if something large enough to cause continental scale firestorms hit the Earth, where's the crater? The impact hypothesis proponents have good answers to this objection: the ice sheet absorption, the subsequent glacial erasure of surface topography, the sea level rise that submerged coastal impact sites. But none of these answers can be fully verified without direct physical evidence of a crater, which by the nature of the proposed scenario is difficult or impossible to recover. There has been one potential candidate for an impact structure associated with the Younger Dryas event. The Hiawatha crater, discovered in 2018 beneath the Greenland ice sheet by a team of researchers using radar data, is a large circular depression under approximately a kilometer of ice. It is approximately 31 kilometers in diameter, which would make it one of the 25 largest known impact craters on Earth. When it was first announced, several researchers immediately noted the possibility that it could be the Younger Dryas impact site. The problem is that initial dating of material associated with the crater places its formation at a minimum of 12,000 years ago, but potentially much older, possibly hundreds of thousands of years old. The precise dating of a crater hidden under a kilometer of ice using the available methods is extremely difficult. The Hiawatha crater may or may not be the smoking gun that the impact hypothesis needs. The work to determine its age more precisely is ongoing. Additional radar surveys of the Greenland ice sheet are being conducted that may reveal additional subglacial structures. The ice itself may contain at depth the impact record that would allow the crater to be precisely dated. This work is difficult, expensive, and slow, but it is happening. Meanwhile, the evidence in the sediment keeps accumulating. More sites, more markers, more independent researchers finding what Firestone's team first identified and what Kennett's team has worked to systematize. The global distribution of the impact markers continues to expand. The chemical analyses continue to improve in precision and reproducibility. The dating continues to tighten, with multiple independent dating methods all pointing to the same moment in time. The scientific community is slow to change its consensus. This is appropriate and it is a feature, but the direction of travel is clear to anyone who reads the literature carefully and without the prior commitment to any particular explanation. The evidence for an extraordinary event at 12,800 years ago is overwhelming. The evidence that this event was at least partly extraterrestrial in origin is strong and growing stronger. The evidence that this event caused or substantially contributed to the Younger Dryas cooling, the megafaunal extinctions, and the collapse of the Clovis culture is consistent and coherent across multiple independent lines of inquiry. Canada's first civilization was not simply outcompeted or climatically stressed into oblivion. It was struck by something that came from the sky on a day that the surviving peoples of the world tried to remember in every story they had. The black mat preserves the moment. The platinum marks the day. The nanodiamonds carry the pressure of an impact that the human world was not prepared for and could not have survived intact. And the frozen permafrost of the Yukon holds the bones of the last mammoths standing sentinel at the boundary between the world that was and the world that is. We live in the world that was rebuilt from that catastrophe. Every city, every road, every field under cultivation, every nation and language and institution and tradition is downstream from the event. The agricultural revolution that made civilization possible happened in the warm, stable Holocene that followed the Younger Dryas. The indigenous cultures of Canada that were present at European contact were the product of 11,000 years of rebuilding after the catastrophe. The European cultures that made contact were the product of the same rebuilding in a different part of the world. All of us are the descendants of the survivors of the Younger Dryas. All of us carry in our bodies and our cultures the legacy of a moment when the sky fell and the world was remade. The frozen evidence is the record of that moment. The living world is the record of the survival. That is the story. That is the whole story. 12,800 years old and still frozen in the ground beneath Canada, waiting to be fully understood, waiting for the science to catch up to what the earth has been preserving all along. The ice remembers everything, and now, finally, we are remembering too.